Video game culture has changed a lot over the years, and it has given rise to a number of icons, recognizable figures that are inseparable from the games and genres they represent. Halo Guy and Doomer Chief will forever be the patron saints of first-person shooters. Discussions about early 3D platformers will seldom neglect to mention Banjo and Kazooie, Crash Bandicoot, or Spyro the Dragon, and the same is true for RPGs and Final Fantasy. But there are some icons that are able to transcend their cultural context and become, if not mainstream, widely known by the general public. Super Mario would be an obvious example. You'd be hard-pressed to find someone that wouldn't recognize this handsome face.
Oh yeah!
A more recent and perhaps less savory example is Fortnite. The word has become a household name for the gaming habits of the younger generation, and regardless of any negative connotations, its pervasive presence in the mainstream culture is undeniable. But even among these, I feel that what we're talking about today is unique. It was made with the purpose of usurping Mario's place on the video game throne, and while it was perhaps not successful in doing that, at least in the long run, it didn't need to be. It carved out its own healthy chunk of public awareness, a slice of the scene that it has somehow clung to through 30 years of uncertainty, disappointment, and failure. I am, of course, talking about Sonic the Hedgehog. It doesn't matter if you grew up playing Sega, Nintendo, PlayStation, Xbox, or the Steel Drums, you know who Sonic is. He's the Blue Blair, the fastest thing alive, and he just refuses to die. There are a number of games in this series that are heralded as unimpeachable masterpieces by their fans. But at the same time, there are some who claim it is home to some of the worst games of all time. Either way, it's impossible to deny that Sonic the Hedgehog has been through some ups and downs. Even so, YouTube is stuffed full of loving retrospectives and impassioned defenses of this speedy rodent, and each new release is greeted with buzzing, albeit cautious, excitement. So as an outsider to the series, I'm curious to find out why. I've only really played 2 Sonic games, and I didn't beat either of them, so my experience with the franchise is very limited. But that does not mean my exposure to it has been. As I explained before, Sonic the Hedgehog is everywhere, so I'm not exactly approaching it with a blank slate. I have some preconceived notions, and I have a pretty good idea of which games are considered good or bad by the community. But I'm not here to uphold or upend those expectations, or to choose a side in the age-old debates. I'm here to experience the games for myself and come up with my own opinions on them. I'm planning to play every main game in the series, so be sure to like and subscribe. This is my first video, and I honestly have no idea what it's going to look like. But let's go ahead and get this hedgehog rolling. Before we really get into the first game, let's talk about first impressions. From the moment you load up the menu, it's clear that the developers were trying to make something special, and I think it's undeniable that they succeeded. Even 30 years later, after all the ups and downs and memes and 06s, I still think Sonic is a fantastic mascot, and his personality shines from the moment he appears. Without saying a word, his cocky, cool guy attitude comes across loud and clear. Later iterations of Sonic have a tendency to be kind of cringy dweebs, but not this Sonic. He looks fun and cool, the kind of guy you want to be friends with, and the astounding visuals really do him justice. Genesis games almost always look good, but the vibrant colors and dynamic backgrounds of this game are really striking, establishing its identity with contagious confidence. The whole game just has a distinct charm, and the love its makers put into it is plain to see even before you start playing. Now that I've finished appreciating the menu screen, it's time to actually play this thing, and I'll be honest, I didn't go into this expecting much. I'm not the biggest fan of 2D platformers at the best of times, and this is an old game. I was expecting a lot of clunk and jank and annoyance, but by the time I finished the first level, I was very pleasantly surprised. The controls are simple and responsive, and Sonic has much more handling than I had anticipated. You're able to pull off some tight platforming, which is good because there are some segments in this game that require some precision. The level design was intricate and engaging, tailor-made for Sonic to run, jump, and spin through. It was surprisingly fun to explore and experiment, and there always seemed to be a reward waiting after a tricky bit of platforming or some thorough exploration. I beat the first level, grabbed a Chaos Emerald, more on that later, and jumped into the next level. I can't stress enough how great Green Hill Zone is as a starting area. It's perfectly designed to teach you how to control Sonic and how to navigate these levels, and it has a great song to go with it. I got to the end of Act 2 expecting a boss fight, and was a little confused when I found myself at the beginning of an Act 3. I was under the impression that Sonic zones had always been split into two, so this caught me by surprise. But it didn't take long to reach a ridiculously easy boss and move on to the next zone, thoroughly impressed by what I had seen so far and looking forward to what was next. Marble Zone is where the game really starts, and the difficulty ramps up quickly. I lost my first life here, and I was finding it difficult to hold on to my rings. My utter lack of skill really began to shine through, as I blundered half-blind through the trap-infested ruins. Most of my misfortunes were due to mistakes on my part, but I also began to notice a trend of, if not quite unfair, decidedly underhanded level design. I found myself losing all of my hard-earned rings in circumstances I couldn't possibly have avoided. Sometimes it felt like the only way to make it through was blind luck and trial and error, but I managed to struggle through another 3 acts and made it to the zone boss. It was also ridiculously easy, but I still managed to earn my first game over here, though Eggman clearly cheated if you look closely. Fortunately, I had earned a continue, so I got a fresh set of lives and did Act 3 over again, exacting my revenge on the Rotund Sneak. I didn't like Marble Zone as much as Green Hill, but the levels were still fun to explore and I was still enjoying myself. Next came Springyard Zone, an ambiguously themed set of levels full of bumpers and, if you can believe it, springs. It was here that I began to realize something. The harder the game got, the less I was enjoying it. Now, before you hit me with the get good, skill issue, or mad 'cause bad, don't bother, because the game already beat you to it. Imagine you're struggling through this incredibly punishing and maddeningly sneaky level. You've had to play through the game twice to get here because you're too stupid to know how save states work, and you're starting to get a little grumpy. You're just about to complain, and then bam. The game hits you with 4 big blinking letters. So if there was ever any doubt that this game has attitude, there's the proof. Once I recovered from my shock and humiliated rage, I was able to carry on and beat the zone, but my playthrough had taken a significant turn. I was no longer exploring and engaging with the levels as I had been. I was just trying to get to the end by any means necessary. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not criticizing the game for being difficult. Challenging gameplay is a good thing, and many of my favorite games are quite a trial. It wasn't simply the difficulty level that was bothering me. It was the manner in which the game was achieving it. It just didn't feel fair, and more of my deaths seemed entirely unavoidable. And for a game that is entirely built on the premise of going as fast as you can, it brutally punishes you for doing so. Every time I started to pick up speed, I would almost immediately run into some obstacle or tumble down some hole. There's just no way to react when you're moving this fast with a view this narrow. These levels are just not built to let you run, and I found myself constantly checking my speed, which is not what I expected to be doing while playing Sonic the Hedgehog. Now, it may be that this game was designed around level memorization, and I'm sure there are people who can zip through these stages like it's nobody's business. But for a casual player like myself, it just felt like the game was playing me, not the other way around. By the time I reached the end of Springyard Zone, the sense of accomplishment and satisfaction I felt upon beating a stage had been replaced by sheer relief. My favorite part of each level going forward quickly became the exit. What had started as a crisp, satisfying experience had become a frustrating slog, and the clunk I had been dreading began to rear its head. I was only an hour into the game, and it was already starting to overstay its welcome. Having 3 acts in each zone made the game feel slow, though I understand this was probably just due to resource limits. Even the music, which I loved at first, was starting to get grating. The tracks are just a bit too samey and repetitive, though each on their own is fine. But I don't want to be too harsh. I feel that some of the things I've criticized may just be relics of the era. Game design was really different back then, and the intense difficulty was a feature, not a fault. And though it's true that I lost a great many lives in less than honest ways, I'm also very new to the game, and bad to boot. A little more time with the game would probably do a lot to smooth out the experience, but I can only speak to the experience I did have, and these are my honest takeaways from my time with it. In spite of all this, Labyrinth Zone was a breath of fresh air. It was still incredibly difficult, but the slower pace of underwater gameplay allowed the better aspects of the game to shine through, those being the creative platforming and level exploration. Underwater levels have a less than savory reputation in the video game scene, but I have no problems with them in Sonic 1. Hurrying from bubble to bubble is intense and exciting, and there was only one instance where I felt cheated after floating down this really long tube and having to scramble to find a bubble afterwards. This level also brought back the exploration aspect that I enjoyed in the earlier levels, with lots of verticality and shortcuts and alternate routes. The song was also much better than the previous two zones, at least to my ears. I had a legitimately good time in this level, but even before I reached the third act, I was dreading the boss fight. All of the bosses so far had been trivial, my ridiculous buffoonery aside, but somehow I figured this one would be different. Boy was I right. This was an absolute nightmare. Now, granted, my aforementioned buffoonery was on full display here, as I had it in my head that I had to kill him while he was moving. But in my defense, this very level had introduced a looping segment that I spent an embarrassing amount of time waiting to end, so I assumed that would be the case here. About 20 deaths later, don't worry, I had figured out save states by this point, I decided to just see how far I could go, and sure enough, I reached the end just fine, so I guess it wasn't as brutal as I thought. After taking a moment of consideration for my cardiovascular health, I pressed on to the next zone, Starlight Zone. This is also a pretty good set of levels, with lots of different ways to reach the end and more chances for speed than most others. It still suffered from the same inhospitable level design as earlier stages, and I wasn't a huge fan of the theming or the music, but I was beginning to forgive the game a little bit for my previous hardships. Starlight Zone had my favorite boss fight in the game. It utilizes these levers that you encounter earlier in the zone to launch spikes up at Eggman. It's pretty fun, and it can be hard to predict where the next one is coming down if you're not paying attention. Before we move on to the final zone of Sonic the Hedgehog, I want to take a moment to look at the bonus stages. If you manage to collect 50 rings and hold them until the end of the level, you're given a chance to complete a bonus stage and collect one of the 6 Chaos Emeralds. Now, I don't know what the general consensus on these levels is, but I'm not going to bury the lead. I think they are terrible. The way the level tilts back and forth at this choppy pace is chaotic and disorienting, and Sonic becomes nearly impossible to control with everything shifting and spinning around him. Just like every other level in the game, you can easily lose to something you had no way of knowing was there, and my god, the visuals. It's confused and undistinguishable as it is, but that background. Aside from being utterly nonsensical, I mean, why are there birds? It just further jumbles what you're looking at, making the whole experience positively nauseating. The hypnotic display and eerie, depressing music makes this feel more like Sonic's night terrors than a fun reward for keeping your rings, and it's easily the worst gameplay on the whole experience. The reward for collecting all the emeralds is just a minutely altered ending, and for me at least, it just wasn't worth braving 6 of these nightmares. So I didn't. With that out of the way, the only thing left to talk about is the final area, Scrap Brain Zone, and I'll be honest, it's a bit of a lackluster finale. I think Sonic 1 overall has a bit of a theming problem. After Green Hill Zone, which itself is pretty generic, though the stellar visuals do a lot for it, the zones get progressively flatter and less vibrant. Mystic Hill is alright, but Spring Yard is completely abstract and unappealing. Labyrinth Zone is a full monochrome, and the same goes for Starlight Zone. Unfortunately, this trend continues into Scrap Brain Zone as well. I guess this is supposed to be like Eggman's factory or something, but I didn't even realize I was on the last zone until I got to the final boss. It's just gray and flat, with no interesting or fun theme. I'm sad to say that none of the zones lived up to what Green Hill promised, both in terms of gameplay and especially visual design and theming. Scrap Brain's gameplay was mostly unremarkable as well, just more of the stop-and-go platforming I had come to expect, though there is a fun twist where Eggman lures you into a trap at the end of Act 2, dropping you into an abyss. This makes Scrap Brain the only zone in the game to feature a different aesthetic for one of its acts, though it's just a recoloring of Labyrinth Zone's assets. With Scrap Brain out of the way, it's time for the final boss. The game calls this the final zone, but I don't really count it as its own zone. The boss fight itself is fairly anticlimactic, although I honestly wasn't expecting much. It's not very hard and not at all that interesting. You just wait for these pistons to come down and you hit the one that Eggman is in. The hardest part for me was actually noticing that Eggman was even there. But once you beat this, you've beaten Sonic the Hedgehog. You're treated to a short but charming clip of Sonic running through Green Hill with his rescued animal buddies. If you collected all the Chaos Emeralds, this is where they show up. If you haven't collected all of them, Eggman appears after the credits, smugly taunting you with the ones you failed to collect, but I wasn't impressed. He can keep them if it means I don't have to go into the existential hell that is the bonus stages. It is a fun detail though, letting the player know that the game has more to offer. So, that was my experience with the inaugural entry in the Sonic the Hedgehog series, and after saying all this, I feel like I may have come across a bit harsher than I intended. I stand by the criticisms I've made, but I think this game is fantastic regardless. Sure, the level design gets a little clunky, and the visuals kind of drop off as the game goes on, and the pacing is somewhat of a slog, but I had to remind myself that this was the very first game. Growing pains are expected, and considering that, it's pretty darn amazing that they were able to make this. There's a confidence to this game that I love, like it knows it's the start of something great. There's so much in Sonic the Hedgehog that communicates the passion and genius of the developers behind it. The crisp, engaging animations, the sprawling verticality of the levels, the brilliant character design of both Sonic and Eggman. Again, my gripes are legitimate, but I'm sure much of the things I didn't like were due to limitations on resources, time, and experience. It's a flawed but beautiful masterpiece of creativity and talent, and it's no wonder that this would go on to father one of the most recognizable icons of video game culture. No matter where he may have gone after this, you can't deny that Sonic the Hedgehog got off to a running start.
Sequels are by their very nature a flip of the coin. When making a follow-up to an established piece of media, there are endless possibilities, thousands of different ways you can go. But in the end, every sequel will boil down to just one question. Is it better or worse than what came before? It isn't good enough to just be as good. By slapping that big number 2 next to the title, you're promising that this one is bigger. Bigger means better, and better is what people will be expecting. There are innumerable examples of sequels that failed to meet that expectation throughout all of history. I one time saw an entire trilogy that was a bad sequel. But every once in a while, the planets align and bless us with a sequel that doesn't just meet expectations, but blows them away entirely. The Empire Strikes Back, Spider-Man 2, Mountain Blade Bannerlord, Banjo-Tooie, Captain America the Winter Soldier. Does that count? Depending on how you look at it, it's either the 9th, 10th, or 2nd movie in a series, but it comes between a 1 and a 3, so I'm calling it a sequel. In any case, these movies all took what came before them and improved and built on it, and are, in my opinion, much better than their predecessors. They are excellent examples of what all sequels should try to do. Don't reinvent the wheel or throw the baby out with the bathwater, but don't be afraid to explore new ground or take risks. This video itself is a sequel, you might say. In my previous video, I talked about the Sonic series' impressive first entry, and I briefly mentioned having played only 2 Sonic games in my life. Well, one of those games is Sonic the Hedgehog 2, the sequel to Sonic the Hedgehog. So I was excited to see how it lives up, both to its predecessor and my own memories. I was a useless child when I played it, so I never got very far, but I remember it being a fun game with great music. So how does it stack up? Well, we'll get into that, but first be sure to like and subscribe, and check out my first video if you haven't seen it yet. With that out of the way, let's see how Sonic followed up the success of their first entry. The game starts up very similarly to the first. Sonic zips by to introduce the Sega logo, which is very cool and iconic, and I like it. Then we're greeted by an almost identical title screen as... Wait a minute, who is that? That's right, Miles Prower, or Tails, was introduced in this game, a fact I had completely forgotten. And he isn't confined to the title screen or the sideline. He runs alongside you throughout the entire game. He fits instantly into Sonic's admittedly small roster of characters, and he's been a staple ever since, so I guess he was a hit. I've never been a fan of Tails myself, but I mostly know him from Sonic Heroes, so you can probably understand why. But here he's just cute and colorful, and he adds some depth and character to the world of Sonic, so I have no complaints. As the game begins, it's immediately clear that things have stepped up a notch. The title cards that display the zone and act are stylish and colorful, way better than the ones from Sonic 1. Where Sonic was a little squat and stumpy before, here he has better proportions, allowing for more dynamic animations. And just look at that background, just gorgeous. I didn't notice this until after I had uploaded my previous video, but in Sonic 1, the only dynamic background was Green Hill. The rest were pretty much static images, with maybe some blinking lights. In Sonic 2, nearly all of the backgrounds have this really impressive, almost 3D parallax effect, and they're all even better than Green Hill. And I'm not just trying to compare or knock on the first game, but it's hard not to. It feels like Sonic 2 is trying to one-up its predecessor at every turn. I mean, the first zone is called Emerald Hill. Emerald is just better green. I'm not criticizing Sonic 1 here, I'm just praising 2 for going above and beyond something that was already great. As far as gameplay goes, controlling Sonic feels just about identical to what came before. You can run, jump, and curl into a ball. There's really only two key differences. The first is that Tails follows along with you as you go, and I'll go ahead and say that I don't really like this aspect of the game. It's a neat addition, and Tails has some fun animations, but it's also a little awkward. He serves no gameplay purpose whatsoever, except he can collect rings, which to be fair is pretty useful, and every once in a while he might bump into an enemy and kill it. But most of the time he's just struggling to keep up with Sonic, jumping wildly and just dying. There were even a couple of times where he seemed to get in the way. Even with that said though, I'm glad he's here. He adds personality to the game, and it's pretty cool that Sonic has a friend to run and fight alongside. I don't remember what I thought about this as a kid, but I'm willing to bet other kids found it pretty cool. And if it isn't your thing, you can actually choose to play without Tails, or as Tails if you're so inclined, so that is a neat inclusion. The other new mechanic is the spin dash. I caught myself trying to do this in Sonic 1 and was saddened by its absence, so it's very nice to have it here. You just charge up in place and take off. This means you can pick up speed without having to get a running start, which is good if you botch a ramp or a loop or something. I actually didn't end up using it that much throughout play, because the level design didn't usually call for or allow it, but it's a nice tool to have, and it is very satisfying. Being able to take off on a dime just feels like something Sonic should be able to do. After Emerald Hill comes Chemical Plant Zone. This one is a classic, and it is for good reason. I think this is my favorite Sonic zone so far. It looks amazing with the yellow and blue and pink on a vibrant and detailed background, and the music is excellent. But what really makes these levels great is the way it just lets you move. This is Sonic at its best. The sheer speed you can achieve is intoxicating, and rolling up and down these hills is a blast. This was the only time I was disappointed to only have 2 acts instead of 3, a change I otherwise appreciate greatly as it keeps the pace of the game snappy. I sure hope nothing comes along to change that later. Next we have Aquatic Ruin Zone. This one is a bit like Labyrinth Zone from Sonic 1, with lots of underwater gameplay. I like the approach here even better though. Instead of there being underwater and above water portions of the level as you go along, it's more like half the level is submerged. If you can play well enough, you can keep your feet on the ground and stay above water. But if you fall into a pit or a trap, you'll sink to the bottom and have to fight your way back to the surface before you drown. It's another great example of how Sonic 2 refines and builds on the gameplay from Sonic 1, and I think it's stellar. Casino Zone comes next, and it is really unique. It feels almost like a playground, where you're free to bounce and roll around in these pinball machines. There aren't very many enemies or traps, so it's kind of just a fun zone. And it looks so nice. I mean, that nighttime city background is just amazing. Hilltop Zone follows, a level high on a mountain with lots of platforming, then Mystic Cave, which is full of traps and sneaky enemies. Not to keep repeating myself, but I just can't stress enough how beautiful these levels are. This is exactly what I wanted from the later levels of Sonic 1, what Green Hill set me up to expect. The theming is much more varied and unique, the aesthetics are atmospheric and appealing, and the dynamic backgrounds add so much depth and life. I hit my first stumbling block with Oil Ocean Zone. I'd had my fair share of deaths before this point, but this is where Sonic 2 really starts to test you. It wasn't brutally, unfairly difficult, though these stupid burner things always tricked me, but it was a sure sign of things to come. I will say that the way Eggman smiles at the camera with pure, unfettered, and evil joy when he shows up in his submarine is probably my favorite thing ever.
I just love submarines. They're so sneaky.
Speaking of bosses, they're alright in this game. They usually involve Eggman in some delightfully ridiculous contraption, and several of them tie directly into the level theme, like when he tries to dump chemicals on you or when he goes submarining in the oil ocean. They're all fine with 3 notable exceptions, but this is probably where you'll run into the most jank, and I died in some silly ways on these. As we move on to Metropolis Zone, I want to take a minute to discuss the music. I didn't say much about the music in Sonic 1, but I'll be frank. I legitimately didn't like some of the songs, and altogether the soundtrack was a little abrasive. In Sonic 2, there's not a single song that isn't an absolute bop. It is just banger after banger, and I say this is one of the greatest video game soundtracks ever. Metropolis Zone might have my favorite song in the game, which is good because I spent a lot of time here. These levels really ate my lunch. It wasn't the level design or the traps that kept getting me, it was the enemies. I wouldn't be surprised if I lost all my rings every time an enemy came on screen. These crabs will punch you with ridiculous speed, and even if you try to jump over their claw, you'll probably still get hurt. I'm convinced these mantis bots are impossible to react to as a human being. They throw their claws the instant they come on screen, and they stick around even after you've killed them. And once these starfish show up, it's just a roll of the dice if they hit you, and the dice are weighted.
We'll let the fate decide, huh?
But eventually, I struggled to the end of Act 2, bruised and battered, and hey, where's the boss? Oh god, no. There's an Act 3, and it is an act of vicious malice. This may be the single most hostile level I have ever played in a video game. It is out to kill you by any means. There were a few places that functioned essentially as ring gates. If you want to pass, you have to hand over your rings, no questions asked. And then when you do make it to the boss, it's a ridiculous, messy, murderous catastrophe. I had to cheese it to make it past. Overall, I did not have a good time in this zone, thanks almost entirely to the brutality of its third act, and I was very relieved to leave it behind. It didn't leave a bad taste in my mouth like some of the levels in Sonic 1, but my patience had been severely tested. Fortunately, I got a little bit of a breather in Sky Chase Zone, where we catch a ride on Tails' plane to chase down Eggman's battleship in the sky. It's pretty easy, but it's also fun and adds a little flavor to Sonic's quest. Sonic 1 ended abruptly with the ambiguous Scrap Brain Zone, but Sonic 2 has a much grander finale in store, starting with Wing Fortress Zone, which itself is not that great. Maybe I'm just really dumb, but I could not figure out how to get past these propellers. I ended up just grabbing this shield and using it to get through. Maybe that's what you're supposed to do, but either way, it is some wonky level design. But that pales in comparison to the boss, which is a nightmare beyond reckoning. It's a mashup of all of Sonic's worst parts: unforgiving and inconsistent platforming, unrecoverable rings, and of course, unavoidable deaths. This is the worst boss so far, but if you manage to survive it, the game rewards you with a very cool cutscene of Sonic catching a ride on Eggman's spaceship, as he leaves the atmosphere and takes us to his home base, the Death Egg. Here, Sonic must do battle with a robotic version of himself, as Eggman watches on with maniacal glee. This is a fun and surprisingly cinematic boss fight, and would have made for a satisfying climactic finale if it was actually the final boss. Eggman has one last trick up his sleeve, meaning yet another boss battle. I didn't really enjoy this one. It's a little bit jank and requires ridiculously precise timing, but I have to admit it's a stylish and visually impressive final battle. With Eggman defeated and the Death Egg destroyed, Sonic falls back towards Earth, but Tails arrives in his plane just in time to save him, and with that, we've beaten Sonic the Hedgehog 2. But if you've played this game before, you might be thinking I've missed something, and that's because I have. I got to the end of this game without seeing a single bonus stage. In the first game, getting into a bonus stage was a simple matter of beating a non-boss level with 50 rings in your possession. You might remember from my previous video that I was not a fan of these stages, and that the reward for getting all the emeralds was lackluster and not worth. So it was with a great deal of reluctance that I booted up Sonic 2 again to see how its own bonus content stacks up, and just like everything else, it was a major improvement. Instead of having to make it to the end of a level, you just have to make it to a checkpoint with 50 rings. There were a number of times in my first playthrough that I almost entered a bonus stage by accident, but I never noticed. The stages themselves are still not my favorite thing. You have to collect a certain number of rings in 3 different sections as you run along, which is not as easy as it sounds. The pseudo 3D is interesting, but also difficult to navigate, and it actually made me a little motion sick. It's impossible to predict or react to what's around these corners or over these hills, so you might miss a stack of rings, or worse, run into a bomb and lose a chunk of what you've already collected. It's unique, and I admire the ambition, but for me at least, it didn't quite land in application. Even so, it's leagues better than what came before, and it actually feels like a bonus rather than a bizarre and unsettling detour. But what really makes these levels an improvement is the reward. Instead of a mere cutscene, Sonic 2 rewards players who can collect all 7 Chaos Emeralds with the ability to go supersonic, which makes you completely invincible and gives you higher jumps and more speed. That is a reward worth grinding for, and because you can get an emerald at every checkpoint, assuming you have the rings, you can actually unlock supersonic before you leave Emerald Hill. For the rest of the game, by pressing jump while in midair and holding 50 rings, you can go supersonic, which trivializes anything that might have been a challenge before. It's a well-hidden secret, but it's the kind worth searching for. And with that, I think we've seen everything Sonic the Hedgehog 2 has to offer. What a game! Everything the first game did good, this one does better, without many of the blemishes and with so much more polish. The last few levels approached a difficulty I'm comfortable calling unfair, but as we discussed last time, that just comes with the territory with old games. I'm already starting to see why Sonic is such a cultural monolith. With a start this strong, how could it not be? The first game was a respectable and impressive start, but it's clear to me that Sonic the Hedgehog 2 is where the series started picking up speed.
Expectations can be a double-edged sword. They can lead to pleasant surprises and bitter disappointments, but one thing is for sure. It's hard not to have them. When I set out to make a retrospective on the Sonic the Hedgehog series, I went in with an open mind, determined not to let my biases color my experience with it. But even with that goal in mind, I couldn't entirely shake off my preconceptions. I expected Sonic 1 to be an ambitious start to the series with a few growing pains, and I expected Sonic 2 to improve and expand on what came before and iron out some of the clumsiness. I happen to be mostly right in those assessments, and you can check out my videos on those games to hear more. But as I went into the next game in the series, I found myself completely at a loss as to what I should expect. Sonic CD is often overshadowed by its contemporaries. I wasn't even aware of it until very recently, and all I knew about it going in was what could be gleaned from the title, so this was brand new territory for me. But I was excited to discover more. This was the whole reason I started making this series, to experience Sonic firsthand from beginning to end. One thing to note before we begin though, I played Sonic 1 and 2 on an emulator, to avoid paying for the official versions because I'm cheap and broke, but also to experience them as authentically as I could, without hunting down a Genesis. For Sonic CD, however, I had trouble finding trustworthy emulation, and I like to pay for the games I play anyway, especially now that I'm making content with them. So I bought Sonic Origins, and that's how I played Sonic CD. This is the only version of the game that I've played, and I'm fairly confident that it's a faithful port, but there may be some differences that impacted my experience that I wasn't aware of. With that said, let's see what the odd child of classic Sonic has to offer. It's clear from the moment you start up the game that Sonic CD is different from what came before. The title screen is more realistic, for lack of a better term, and just speaking from first impressions, I don't like the change. The bright colors and smooth shapes of Sonic 1 and 2 have a timeless charm that's missing here, making it seem aged in a way its predecessors avoided. But that's not what sticks out the most here. Part of the reason I didn't trust the emulations I played is that I just couldn't believe this music belonged here. It sounds too good for a Genesis game, like, where's that classic 16-bit crunch? But remember, this is Sonic CD, and thanks to the higher storage capacity of CDs compared to cartridges, it's possible to include high-definition music, and, as we'll see in a moment, cutscenes. This makes Sonic CD one of the most impressive games for its time, and it definitely wears that on its sleeve. I'm not super interested into digging into the background behind the games I cover, but it's pretty obvious that this game was made for two primary reasons. The first would be to sell CD add-ons, as a mainline Sonic game is sure to ship units, and the next would be to show off what that add-on is capable of, as its flagship title. It certainly accomplishes that second goal, as there's a level of polish on this game that surpasses even Sonic 2. The graphics and animations are smooth and sharp, and of course the audio quality is crystal clear. The high-quality music paired with the retro graphics can be a bit uncanny, but it's certainly impressive and gives this game a unique identity among its peers. In my opinion, the soundtrack overall is not quite as strong as that of Sonic 2, and it lacks the retro charm of its compatriots, but there are some excellent tracks in here. When I was looking up some of these songs, I discovered that there are actually two separate soundtracks for the Japan and US versions of the game, which is weird, but after listening to both, I do find that I heavily favor the US soundtrack. I particularly enjoy the themes for Tidal Tempest and Wacky Workbench Zones, and Sonic Boom is of course a classic. Speaking of Sonic Boom, that's the song you'll hear during the opening cutscene, which is quite simply delightful.
I love this animation. It's so fun and simple, and it realizes Sonic as a character in a fantastic way, perfectly translating his attitude and charm inherent in his appearance and in-game behavior into a more tangible form. There's not much of substance here, it's just Sonic the Hedgehog doing what he does best. After this cutscene, we're given control, and Sonic CD officially begins with Palm Tree Panic Zone. This game returns to the level structure of Sonic 1 with 3 acts in each zone, but don't panic because the third act of each zone is just a boss fight. The levels are laid out in much the same way as previous games, with lots of verticality and opportunities for speed and exploration. There are some new level features that stand out, however, like these loops that change the perspective and these quaint little past and future signposts. We'll discuss those in a moment. As we near the end of Act 1, Sonic bumps into a cute pink hedgehog who falls immediately in love with him, because I guess he's just that hot. This is Amy Rose, and this marks the beginning of a decades-long saga of Sonic spurning her romantic advances, as he speeds past the goal and leaves her in the dust. I wasn't blown away by Palm Tree Panic Zone. I personally found the song to be pretty obnoxious, and I'm not the biggest fan of the visuals. Emerald Hill and even Green Hill were more exciting introductions to their respective games. That being said, it does do a good job of showing us what to expect, and it introduces many of the little quirks that make up Sonic CD's gameplay. Controlling Sonic is the same as ever. The Spin Dash returns from Sonic 2, and it is joined by a new ability, the Peel Out, or Dash. This allows you to attain even greater speeds from a standstill, though it's a bit riskier since Sonic isn't curled into his defensive ball. It's incredibly fun to use, and makes you feel like a real pro when utilized correctly, and the animation is awesome. This will be a crucial ability, as achieving and maintaining high speeds is integral to Sonic CD's gameplay. Remember those signposts I mentioned? You can run right past these without a second thought and beat the game just fine, but by doing that, you would be missing out on a key part of the experience, and what makes Sonic CD such a unique and interesting game.
Pine trees. Time travel.
By activating a past or future signpost and hitting top speed, Sonic will start to sparkle. If you take damage or lose your speed in any way, you'll miss your chance and have to find another signpost. But if you can maintain the speed for long enough, you'll be zapped into the past or future. On some levels, this is a trivial matter of running off in pretty much any direction for a few seconds, but on others it can be quite difficult to avoid losing speed and require you to find specific areas where it's more viable. Speed is the core concept behind Sonic's gameplay, and CD definitely uses it the most creatively so far. But the time travel is more of a passing novelty or gimmick. Each level in the game is split into 3 different variations based on the present, past, and future. The present is obviously where you start, your typical Sonic Zone fare. The future is a dour mechanical wasteland, but most importantly there's the past, a lush natural landscape. Eggman has sent machines into this past to do something that will alter the timeline and bring about the apocalypse you see in the future levels. In order to truly beat Sonic CD and get the good ending, we have to travel to the past in every single level and destroy a Metal Sonic hologram, and this thing, which the internet says is a robot generator. The end screen of the level will say Sonic made a good future instead of Sonic got through act such and such, which is how I feel every time I get home from work. I don't think I've made a good future once in my life, must be nice. But if we succeed in this task in the first 2 acts of each zone, then when we face the following boss battle, it will be in a healthy landscape full of happy critters instead of the robotic dystopia. Do this for all 8 zones and you get the good ending. A la Sonic 1, it's just a slightly altered cutscene, but unlike Sonic 1, it's actually fun and rewarding to do the work itself. Sonic CD's levels really lend themselves to exploration, and it's a real challenge sometimes to meet the speed requirement for time travel, making it very satisfying to pull off. Overall, this mechanic is a bizarre, creative twist that turns Sonic CD from just another Sonic game to a unique and fascinating experience. That being said, it is still a Sonic game, so what's the rest of it like? Well, after Palm Tree Panic comes Collision Chaos, where our newest groupie is promptly kidnapped by Sonic's robotic doppelganger. Why? Who knows? Maybe he's got a secret crush on Amy, maybe he mistakes her for someone Sonic cares about, which she most definitely is not, or maybe he just hates girls. Whatever the reason, Sonic doesn't want that on his conscience, so it's up to us to save her. Probably. CD has more of a story than its forebears, but it's still fairly inscrutable. As we move forward, we learn where Collision Chaos gets its name, and Sonic learns just how bad a headache can be. The next zone is Tidal Tempest, followed by Quartz Quadrant, and as I'm writing this script, I'm finding that I'm struggling to remember these zones, and that's because they largely aren't that memorable. Sonic CD borrows a lot from Sonic 1, and that includes the more abstract level themes, as opposed to the more concrete, identifiable themes from 2. That's a shame, and more so because I think this game in particular would have benefited from some more creative theming. The bad futures for these levels don't have much impact because I don't have a clue what these places actually are, like, what's so good about this and what's so bad about this? It's a nitpick, I know, but as someone who loved the direction Sonic 2 took the series, it's disappointing to see it take a step back. Another thing that returns from Sonic 1 is the bonus stages, and by that I mean how you access them, reach the goal with 50 rings and jump into the giant spinning ring. Thankfully, the stages themselves are nothing like the ones from the first game. In true early Sonic fashion, it's more pseudo 3D, and it is of course pretty difficult to navigate. The hazards are just flat sprites on the ground, kind of like Super Mario Kart. The goal is to destroy the UFOs hovering about, but they too are just sprites moving around in a 3D space, making it very difficult to gauge their exact position and time your jump right. I struggled a lot with this at first, as you can see, but once I got the hang of it, these levels were a surprising amount of fun. It's both challenging and engaging to navigate these flat levels and avoid the water, which drains your time. It's incredibly satisfying to destroy the UFOs, and some of them are pretty tricky. When I'm rewarded with a Chaos Emerald, I feel like I've really earned it. I was not expecting to enjoy these levels as much as I did, and it was a real incentive to hold on to my rings and get a chance to play them. Fun fact, you can also achieve the good ending by getting all of the Chaos Emeralds, if you're just not in the mood to hunt down time-traveling robots, so that's a nice choice to have. So what else is there to discuss? Boss fights are similar to what we've seen in past games, but there's more emphasis on them, as they each have their own level dedicated to them. Eggman has really amped up his evil factor in this entry. He's animated in a way that makes it look like he's grotesquely bulging out of his suit, and the anxiety-inducing song that plays during the boss fights starts with an unnerving evil laugh. Metal Sonic, on the other hand, turns out to be kind of a pushover. You face off against him, not in a boss fight, but a race, with Eggman bearing down on your tail with an insta-death laser. I say it's a race, but it's more just a matter of being ahead of him when you reach the goal. Yeah, that sounds like a race, but hear me out. If you fall behind, he slows way down, and if you pull ahead, he speeds up and tries to attack you as he passes by. So just going as fast as you can probably won't do the trick, since he can always catch up to you. I beat it by staying close to him and racing ahead as we approach the goal. The door closes and he, being very stupid, slams headfirst into it and apparently dies. Now only Eggman remains, who is waiting for us in the final zone, Metallic Madness. Much like Sonic 1's Scrap Brain, there's nothing real exciting that sets it apart from the rest of the game. That goes for the final boss as well, which Sonic dispatches with ease. Just as the whole place begins to explode, Amy shows up and wow, look at Sonic's face right there. He's like, oh brother. But in spite of his misgivings, he rescues her in the ending cutscene before ditching her once again and chasing down a fleeing Eggman. Then we're treated to an animated retelling of our exploits throughout the game, and that's the end of Sonic CD. Sonic CD, above all else, is a very weird game. It isn't at all what I expected, and it plays with some extremely unique and creative ideas. On paper, it sounds like this shouldn't work at all, but it does. I played through this one a couple of times to make sure I was experiencing everything, and I had a really good time with it. Out of all 3 games I've played, this one might be the most fun to actually play. There were a few bits that I didn't enjoy, like the ridiculous bouncy floor and wacky workbench that made navigating and exploring the levels a nightmare, and sometimes searching for the time-traveling robots was a bit of a drag. The theming is weaker than perhaps even Sonic 1, but the visuals are solid and the soundtrack is excellent. Amy Rose and Metal Sonic are both excellent additions to the growing cast of characters, and Sonic's contagious personality shines through in this entry like never before. Sonic 2 felt like the natural progression of the Sonic formula, the next evolutionary step. This feels like a totally different animal, and I really admire the creativity that went into its conception and the incredible talent required to pull it off. This proves that even early on, Sonic was both willing and able to step out of his comfort zone and deliver truly one-of-a-kind experiences. This game easily could have ended up as a lazy cash grab to sell the CD add-on, but the team behind it went the distance to create something special. It now holds the spot as my favorite Sonic game. We'll see how it does against the competition as we progress through the series, but no matter what happens, Sonic CD will always be a truly inspired detour. Sonic the Hedgehog is a franchise that has never quite been satisfied with its place in the world. As a mascot, Sonic was intended to compete with the likes of Mario, and while he certainly held his own, I think it's fair to say that he never quite matched his Italian rival, and certainly never surpassed him. And to add insult to injury, Mario's prestige has only grown over the years, while Sonic's place on the totem pole has somewhat declined. But that certainly is not for lack of effort. After playing the first 3 main games in the series, one thing I can say for sure is that from the very beginning, Sonic wanted to be the best. I've never seen a franchise just crash onto the scene with this much confidence. Even Nintendo's flagship IPs had humble beginnings, but there has never been anything humble about Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic 1, 2, and CD are all wildly different games, but they all have that bombastic, ambitious attitude in common, and that holds especially true for the 4th game in the series and the subject of today's video, Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Now, I always was and still am a Nintendo kid, so I never had much access to Sonic the Hedgehog. Even so, there are 2 characters in particular that I've always been fond of. One of them is Eggman. I've just always loved this megalomaniacal rapscallion, and he's one of my favorite villains of all time. He's funny and likable while still being an effective and intimidating villain. His gigantic wacky machines are always cool, and he's just a ton of fun all around.
Oh, I've waited a long time for this!
His name is also similar to mine, which I definitely bragged about as a kid. The other character I liked was Knuckles. I mean, how could you not? He's a rough and tough red guy with spikes on his fists and dreadlocks. So I've been looking forward to playing Sonic 3 and Knuckles, the game that introduced him to the series. But before we get into it, there are some things we need to clear up, starting with that awful title. See, Sonic 3 and Knuckles isn't one game. It's actually 2 games put together. This wasn't the developer's original intent, however. According to Takashi Iizuka, one of the designers, it was originally planned to be one game, much bigger in scope than its predecessors. We did 1 and 2, but the plan going forward to 3 was that we really wanted to hit a home run. This ambitious approach ended up costing them, though. Development took longer than they planned, and they soon realized that there wasn't enough data storage on the Genesis cartridges to accommodate the quickly bloating game. So the decision was made to split the game into 2. The first to release was Sonic the Hedgehog 3 in early 1994, followed by Sonic and Knuckles later that year. But not wanting to compromise their vision of an expansive, cohesive Sonic game, they engineered this quaint interlocking cartridge system. By inserting Sonic 3 into Sonic and Knuckles, the 2 games became one, just as God intended. I think this is just the coolest thing, and it really shows off the creative spirit and determination of the developers and designers behind these Sonic games. Sadly, this does mean we're now stuck calling this thing Sonic 3 and Knuckles instead of just Sonic the Hedgehog 3 or just Sonic and Knuckles or anything else that wouldn't be so awkward. But I won't hold that against the game itself. I'm sure there are lots of good people with bad names out there too. Shout out to all the Karens in the world who are perfectly nice and reasonable people who would never think of asking for a manager. But anyway, now that I've explained Sonic 3 and Knuckles' unique and complicated origin, I do want to clarify that I will be treating this as one singular experience, not 2 separate ones. If you're enjoying these videos, please consider liking and subscribing, as that would be a major help. With that said, let's get right into it. Sonic 3 and Knuckles makes its ambition known right off the bat, as a 3D render of Sonic zips onto the screen and gives us his iconic finger waggle. This looks better than Sonic CD's title screen, but still doesn't quite live up to the striking and stylish 2D art of the first 2 games, in my opinion. Upon starting the game, we're given the choice to play as Sonic, Sonic and Tails, or Knuckles. As excited as I was to find that you can play as my boy Knuckles, I did choose Sonic for my first playthrough. The game opens with Sonic and Tails flying over the ocean in a plane. Sonic jumps off and goes supersonic, shooting off at the speed of sound, straight into Knuckles' fist. Wow, and after all those nice things I said about him too. Yeah, as it turns out, Knuckles is a bit of a jerk in this game. But it isn't entirely his fault. According to the manual, Eggman has tricked him into believing Sonic and Tails are after the Chaos Emeralds, which Knuckles is tasked with guarding. This is an insultingly obvious lie on Eggman's part, but Knuckles is a bit mentally challenged, bless his heart.
Oh wait, I can't read.
So while Eggman goes about stealing the emeralds himself to repair his Death Egg, which you might remember from Sonic 2, Knuckles makes it his personal mission to impede Sonic's quest at every turn, smiling smugly all the while. Maybe he's not so cool after all. Now that we've covered the development and story of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, it's time to talk about the game itself. What stands out immediately are the visuals, which are honestly staggering. There were large portions of this game I ended up not enjoying, but throughout the entire experience, I was consistently impressed with how good it looks. Each level has its own unique visual identity with fun and interesting themes. Some of these backgrounds are really dazzling, and I particularly like the ones where you can see the Death Egg looming over the horizon. It makes the world feel tangible and real in a way not many games of this era did. Sonic and the other characters are looking fantastic as well, a perfect balance of visual detail and cartoonish charm. The bright primary colors of Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles are striking and appealing, making them an instantly iconic trio. The sound of the game is excellent as well, pushing that Genesis sound chip to its max. As Sonic buffs will likely tell you, Sonic 3's soundtrack is a little bit complicated. Michael Jackson was involved at some point, though his actual contribution to the tracks was reportedly limited, and they ended up being removed from the game, for reasons I won't go into in this video. If you have some inside info on this subject, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Suffice to say, I am only familiar with the soundtrack that appears in the Sonic Origins versions of the game. It falls short of Sonic CD and Sonic 2's music in my humble estimation, but it holds up and there are a couple of jams hidden here and there. Presentation aside, Sonic 3 and Knuckles take some steps forward in game design for the series as well. It's clear that the developers wanted to go much bigger than before, which, as we discussed, led to it being split into 2 parts. These levels are massive, especially in comparison to previous titles. The game manual boasts zones 3 times bigger than earlier games, and easily lives up to that claim. But they aren't just big. They're stuffed to the brim with intricate design and interesting mechanics. Each zone has its own unique take on enemies, obstacles, platforming, and boss fights, and it's all presented in a surprisingly cinematic way. Each level feels like an event, and I do mean each level. As with Sonic 2 and CD, the game is structured with a series of 2-act zones, but unlike those games, each act within a zone is distinct from one another. Sonic 3 begins with Angel Island Zone, a lush green forest brimming with life, but at the end of Act 1, one of Eggman's robots sets it on fire, transforming it into a blazing inferno for Act 2. This is not only visually exciting, but it adds depth to the game's story, giving the player incentive to stop Eggman before he can cause more harm. Even from Sonic 1, Eggman clearly represented themes of over-industrialization and hyper-capitalism, as he enslaves innocent animals and converts them to mindless drones. But here he really feels like an active threat to the environment, as he burns down forests, crumbles ancient ruins, and pillages the mystical power of the Chaos Emeralds, all to fuel his twisted machinery. This is the most villainous he's been yet. It feels more satisfying than ever to take him down in this game, since we have a first-hand view of his evil and destructive acts. Not every zone is as interesting and eventful as Angel Island, but having a fresh new appearance for almost every single level is a major breath of fresh air. We've come a long way from the monotonous 3-act zones of Sonic 1, and it's a huge improvement. Sonic 3 and Knuckles' core gameplay is almost identical to Sonic 2, with no new mechanics as far as I can tell. Where this game really changes things up is its level design. I touched on it just a moment ago, but every level is brimming with unique challenges, requiring creative use of the limited mechanics. This made playing through the game a much more diverse and sustainable experience, which is good because it's quite long. Most of the time, encountering these unique obstacles or challenges was a refresh and engaging experience, but there were a couple of times that I ran into some serious frustrations. I got stuck in Carnival Night Zone trying to figure out how to get past this bouncing block thing. I'd run into it earlier in the zone, but I was able to backtrack and find another route, which I really appreciated. This time, however, I was locked in, forced to deal with it until I brute forced a solution. Turns out you just have to hold up and down over and over again, but there's nothing that indicates or even hints at this. You just have to figure it out or run out of time trying. I'll let you guess which of those happened to me. Speaking of running out of time, I'd like to address what is both Sonic 3 and Knuckles' biggest selling point and its greatest weakness: its scale. As I said, the manual claims that its zones are 3 times the size of those in Sonic 2 and CD, and you really feel it when you're playing through them. They are huge, and to give credit where it's due, this is an impressive accomplishment. These aren't just long stretches of empty space. They are full of challenging obstacles, tight platforming, tough enemies, and whimsical methods of traversal. The verticality of these stages outclasses anything that came before, and they lend themselves well to exploration. The team is really showing off their technical prowess and creative ability, and I admire the ambition and drive to push boundaries. Unfortunately, I have to say that in spite of how technically impressive these levels are,
they often just aren't very fun to play. It's a slow, trudging grind, navigating obstacle after obstacle at a snail's pace. In the 3 games I played before this, I timed out just once, and it was while searching for a robot generator in Sonic CD. In Sonic 3 and Knuckles alone, I timed out 4 separate times. One was admittedly due to my own low intelligence, but the other 3 were just because these levels take too long to get through. Sonic 3 and Knuckles embodies a problem I have with all the classic Sonic games I've played so far. Throughout all of them, there are very few opportunities to really take advantage of and enjoy Sonic's speed. The levels just don't allow for it and actively punish the player for going fast. Not only could you run headfirst into an enemy or hazard you had no way of reacting to, but you could easily miss secrets or hidden paths. You might say this is a personal preference or a nitpick, but I disagree. Sonic as a character is all about speed. It's literally in his name, and every depiction of the character puts a major emphasis on how fast he is. But in-game, that's nowhere to be found. Sonic's gameplay is about platforming and exploration, and it does those things extremely well. Unfortunately, those things do directly clash with the core concept of the series, that being speed. It's a shame, because when you do get a chance to really utilize Sonic's speed, it is so much fun. Starlight Zone and Chemical Plant Zone both allow for more speed than usual, which I think is part of the reason why those levels in particular are remembered so fondly. Sonic CD displays a brilliant balance of speed and exploration, making it my favorite of the classic games by far. But most of classic Sonic gameplay is painstakingly creeping forward at a snail's pace, avoiding enemies and bouncing off obstacles. Sonic 3 and Knuckles is by far the worst offender here, and the sheer length of its levels only makes matters worse. Super Mario levels are more conducive to speed, which is ironic and a little bit sad. Sonic just isn't fast. There are even moments where Eggman outruns him, on foot. If you're going to call your mascot the fastest thing alive, maybe you shouldn't depict him losing a foot race to an overweight old man who has robots do all his heavy lifting for him. Though, to be fair, Eggman does have some long legs. In short, I just would have liked to see Sonic 3 and Knuckles integrate speed into its gameplay in a creative way, like Sonic CD did. It's clear that the focus going into developing this game was making it bigger, not necessarily better. It did improve in some ways, don't get me wrong, I just don't love the direction it took the gameplay, and it might have benefited from being a bit more compact. I can definitely say that it wore out its welcome long before I finished it. Ironically, I think I would have enjoyed Sonic 3 and Knuckles more as 2 separate games as opposed to the intended single experience. As much as I respect the innovation and adore the novelty of the interlocking cartridges, this still ends up feeling like 2 games mashed together. That unfortunate negativity being said, I don't want to ignore what this game accomplishes. Sonic 3 and Knuckles deserves a lot of praise for going above and beyond, especially in terms of presentation. This has to be one of the best looking games of the era, to say nothing of the cinematic action sequences that punctuate the story beats. The music is on par with Sonic games of the era, which is to say it's pretty great. Knuckles is an immediately classic character, and his personality shines through just as strongly as Sonic and Eggman. Every level has its own theme, both in terms of visuals and gameplay. The bosses are fun and unique, the perfect mix of challenging and rewarding. The story is coherent and engaging, and seeing Knuckles turn from a foe to a friend was quite satisfying. It has the most exciting finale out of the game so far, with Sonic and Knuckles teaming up in a boss rush against Metal Sonic, leading up to a final showdown with Eggman. Sonic 3 and Knuckles, oh god, if I have to say that name one more time, I'm gonna jump off a cliff. It's certainly no slouch, in spite of my issues with it. It's something of a swan song for classic Sonic. The advent of the 3D era would take the series in drastically different directions, and we won't see a return to form for a long while. Sonic 3 and Knuckles holds up as a capstone to Sonic's golden age, rounding off a series of games that truly deserve their place in history. The idea that Sonic was never good is more ridiculous than ever to me, and anyone who believes that clearly hasn't given these games a chance. In spite of its flaws, Sonic 3 and Knuckles was a triumphant final hurrah for classic Sonic. Now that I've shoehorned the video title in, there is one little caveat I should address. As Sonic fans know, this isn't exactly the whole story when it comes to Sonic early days. There were a number of various spin-offs during this era, and we will be talking about those at some point. But for now, I think it's time to say goodbye to classic Sonic and move on to his more recent adventures. Thank you so much for watching. Like I said at the beginning of this video, this has been a compilation of my first 4 videos, and if you've made it this far, you can probably tell that there's been some growing pains. Every video is a learning experience, and I'm doing my best to improve, whether it be on writing, editing, or research. I just want to make the best videos that I can, but thank you so much for joining me. Since this was a compilation of 4 videos, I've already asked you to like and subscribe 4 times now, but it would truly be a great help, and I would really appreciate it. I have several video projects coming up that I'm really excited about, and once I'm done with those, I'm going to start on Sonic Adventure. So stick around, I'd love to hear from you in the comments, I'd love to see you in my future videos, and check out some of my other videos in the meantime. But until next time, take care.